Live from our hurricane headquarters with real-time analysis from some of the nation's top meteorologists, this is Tracking the Tropics, powered by Bose Electric.
August nears a close with a mostly quiet Atlantic outside of a wave with a low chance of formation, a perfect opportunity to assess the season and what is ahead with a very special guest, the director of the National Hurricane Center, on this edition of Tracking the Tropics. Welcome into the Stream Center, folks. Yeah, we got a great show for you here today. Of course, you know the hosts of the program, meteorologists Amanda Holly and Rebecca Barry. I'm JB Buno, but in the bottom right, we'll hit the applause button and just welcome in Dr. Michael Brennan joining us from the National Hurricane Center. Cannot wait to pick Dr. Brennan's brain about everything tropics. We want to let you know this is an interactive program. We can feature, of course, your questions and comments from across social media as long as you use one of the hashtags around your screen. Hashtag Hey Rebecca, hashtag Hey JB, hashtag Hey Michael, or hashtag Hey Amanda for, of course, meteorologist Amanda Holly. Before we get to the questions and nerding out with Dr. Brennan, Amanda, we are tracking something way out in the Atlantic.
It's way out there right now, and actually something that we haven't seen for quite some time, really, because the tropics have been unusually quiet for this time of year. But this started to appear late last night. The National Hurricane Center did highlight this area for possible development, but not really until the next 5 to 7 days is when we're looking at this possibly forming into our next name system. So we're keeping an eye on it for sure, but we are watching really early September for something to come out of this region. Our forecast models are kind of hinting at some of this development. Those forecast models that we do look at, the GFS, the American, that we talk about a lot here on Tracking the Tropics, they are finally both kind of hinting at this development early on in September, which is not unusual for this time of year, right? Peak hurricane season right around the corner. It's actually just more unusual that we haven't seen more of these in the past few weeks, but hey, we will take it. So we're going to be watching early September for that. We've got a couple of tropical waves out there that we're watching that haven't even come off the coast of Africa yet, but they are lined up ready to go. So we'll be watching that heading into early September as well. But at the moment, nothing of immediate concern for the Caribbean islands or the United States. Of course, we continue to keep an eye on it. Something, though, also a little bit more unusual is the Pacific Ocean is very active right now. We still have Tropical Storm Onei, which was impacting Hawaii over the weekend. It's now quickly pulling away, but still a tropical storm. And two tropical storms behind it. One, a hurricane, Hurricane Gilma, also could impact Hawaii as we head into the next 5 to 7 days. And we're also watching Hector right behind that. So kind of unusual for us to be tracking 3 tropical systems out in the Pacific with the current atmospheric state. So we're watching this. Obviously, this is not of concern to the, the continental U.S. here, the lower 48. We will be watching that for Hawaii, but just wanted to show you that because just a little bit of an interesting fact here on Tracking the Tropics. But that's kind of what's going on out there. I wanted to be relatively quick with that forecast for you because our guest today is quite special. Dr. Michael Brennan is the director of the National Hurricane Center. We had him scheduled a few weeks ago, but the tropics were a little bit more active, so we rescheduled for today. I'm glad, Dr. Brennan, that it is quiet and we can have you on today. So thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, great to be with y'all.
And just a little bit about you. You've been the director of the National Hurricane Center for several years now, but you've been with the National Hurricane Center for quite some time. Talk a little bit about your background, how long you've been with the National Hurricane Center, what you have been doing there, and what your role is like now.
Yeah, sure. So I came to the Hurricane Center in 2008 as one of the hurricane forecasters, or what we call hurricane specialists here. So I was in that position for about 9 or 10 years. So I was the one of the 10 forecasters here at the time, issuing the forecast, watches and warnings, coordinating all the aircraft reconnaissance, and doing all that coordination and collaboration for the U.S. and internationally. Then I became the branch chief of the Hurricane Specialist Unit in 2018. And had that role until 2023 when I became the director. So first I was supervising that group of hurricane forecasters. And as the director, I'm responsible not only for the hurricane operations that we do here at NHC, but also the marine forecasting mission that we have. And really this job's pretty externally facing, does a lot of outreach, education, training, coordination in the US, internationally. A lot of what we call IDSS, impact-based decision support, through supporting the media, working with emergency managers and others to make sure everybody gets ready for the upcoming hurricane season and then is able to respond and be ready for storms as they approach.
Very cool. Thank you so much for sharing that insight with us. We were talking internally. How big is the National Hurricane Center? Like, how many people are under your command?
Yeah, we have about 50 federal employees here. So we have, we have two sort of different operational branches. We have the Hurricane Specialist Unit, which is sort of more well known in terms of the forecasting they do for the tropical storms and hurricanes. We have 11 forecasters in that branch. We also have a tropical analysis and forecast branch with 18 meteorologists that do marine forecasting analysis across the tropical and subtropical Atlantic and Pacific, and that's a year-round mission. 365 days a year. We also have a group of about 10 research meteorologists. Most of them have PhDs in tropical meteorology, tropical cyclone focus. They work on developing new tools, modeling techniques that enable us to advance the science and get those tools into the hands of our forecasters. And we have an administrative group and the front office and management. But we also have other folks that work here that aren't necessarily officially part of the Hurricane Center that help coordinate aircraft reconnaissance. We have 2 FEMA employees that work in the building. So we really try to bring everybody that's involved in the whole hurricane mission, from observations and forecasting and response, all together under one roof.
They say it takes a team, a village.
Sounds like it.
Yeah. We appreciate each and every single one of you guys that are there and help us get through hurricane season and the 6 months that are not hurricane season as well. So, Dr. Michael Brennan, what's your take on the season so far? We've had 5 named storms. We're predicting, a hyperactive season. You guys updated your forecast early on in August, still calling for, an excessive number of storms. What's your take on what we've seen so far, and what could we see moving forward into the peak?
Yeah, I think what you want people to take away now is, we are moving right into the peak of hurricane season, and the vast majority of the activity in a typical season is still to come. It really, after you get past September 1st and well into October, and even busy years can extend well into November, we could be looking at an additional, 10 to 15, maybe even more named storms. We've seen Category 5 hurricane already when we saw Beryl forming in June and July. So very unusual there. In terms of the overall strength and duration of the storms we've had so far this year, it's been well above average, even though the number of named storms at 5 now is sort of more what you typically see as you get into late August, early September. We've had a major hurricane, we have 2 other hurricanes. So it's been busy. We've had numerous impacts in the Caribbean with Beryl, and in the United States with both Beryl and Debbie. And Ernesto impacting Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands just a couple of weeks ago. So it's been pretty busy, although we have been pretty quiet lately. But as you see on the chart you're showing there, we're going up the roller coaster pretty fast now, and we hit that peak where we're most likely to have storms going on as we get into that sort of second week of September. And then you can see September into October stays very, very busy. So the main message to take away: in September, we can get formation anywhere in the basin, all the way from the deep tropical Atlantic, like that system we're looking at now. We can have systems form much closer to land, much closer to Florida in the Caribbean or the Gulf of Mexico, off the southeast coast of the United States, near the Bahamas. And that risk for Florida extends well into the tail of the season, whereas some other parts of the basin sort of shut down a little earlier. The Caribbean Gulf area stays active all the way through October, even into November in some years. So folks in Florida have to basically pay attention and be ready the entire hurricane season, all the way from June through November.
And I started about 20 years ago, which is weird because I'm only 25, but I'm not good at math. But the hurricane forecast, the spaghetti models used to actually look like cooked spaghetti, and it's come so far. Hurricane forecasting has gotten so good with the introduction of AI and other advancements. How much better do you think it could get?
Well, there's definitely a lot of room for improvement, especially in intensity forecasting and forecasting the structure of storms. And certainly there's still challenges in forecasting storm track, especially for storms moving parallel to the west coast of Florida, like we've seen in the last few years, going back to Ian, even Debbie earlier this year, Idalia. A small change in the track can make a huge difference in where those worst impacts are going to occur. So we're always striving to make those forecasts better. But areas of real focus going forward are going to be continuing to improve forecasts of rapid intensification. We've gotten better at that somewhat, but that's still challenging. But we really want to get into those hazards. How can we better improve the forecasting of storm surge, both the coverage and the magnitude? How deep is the water going to be? Rainfall flooding. How do we depict areas that are more likely to flood from heavy rainfall? Getting into the forecast of the impacts of winds, especially wind gusts, are all areas we're trying to advance on, from the science perspective.
Again, live here on Tracking the Tropics with Dr. Michael Brennan, director of the National Hurricane Center. I see we've got a lot of folks in the comment section from David, Barbara, Anthony, and a lot of others. Again, we're going to get to your social media comments here for Dr. Brennan in just a few minutes. You can use any of the hashtags around your screen to ask a question for Dr. Brennan. Dr. Brennan, my question is actually right on cue with Amanda. Amanda and I and Rebecca, we're usually very much in lockstep. It's about the preseason forecast. I am fascinated by this from a work standpoint and how much work actually goes into, for you and your team, making a preseason forecast to pinpoint and to try to predict the future of the entirety of the season must be a gargantuan task. When we're talking about trying to get an idea as to how much work goes into this, how much is it? And also, too, is the NHC fully aware of just how much like publicity these numbers receive? When you put that out there, I mean, my goodness, the media grabs onto it and it becomes, front page news for just about everybody across the country.
Yeah, and we're not the only group operating in this space of seasonal forecasting. There's other groups that are starting to put forecasts out as soon as January or February. NOAA's first forecast comes out in May. We update it in August. But it is still a really difficult challenge scientifically. The seasonal forecasts are of varying quality. Most of the time they're pretty good. Occasionally there are big misses. It just goes to show you that we don't quite understand everything that's going on in terms of what drives, hurricane activity, because we have better tools now in sort of assessing and predicting the large scale patterns and features that are going to be in place sort of on the mean over the bulk of the Atlantic hurricane season. One of the biggest factors is it going to be El Nino, La Nina, or something in between? And then there's obviously, we look at water temperature patterns, upper level wind patterns, all those factors sort of on a seasonal scale. But then there's the day-to-day and even week-to-week variability that happens during a hurricane season. As we can see, we're expecting a busy season this year, but we've had a quiet stretch here for the last few weeks. And that's not all that unusual as conditions change across the basin for more of the day-to-day weather pattern. But yeah, we have 3 or 4 folks here at the Hurricane Center who contribute to the seasonal forecast. It's really a product of the Climate Prediction Center, which is another office in NOAA that does other sort of large-scale seasonal type predictions. But we have some input into it. There's a lot of work that goes into looking at climatology, past patterns. What are seasons with these patterns in the past look like in terms of numbers of storms? And there are now models that are run out months in advance, and you can actually look and count up how many tropical storms or hurricanes come out of these model runs that are run on a seasonal basis. And so all that goes into making these forecasts of these numbers. And as you note here, you have NOAA's forecast, you have Colorado State's, there's many other groups doing these types of forecasts. You all see they all kind of end up in the same general space. So we're all sort of using the same scientific methodology. NOAA provides a range and a confidence index in its forecast to sort of highlight the uncertainty that's inherent in that, the provision of those numbers.
It's always really interesting. I think that, even when the forecasts come out, our newsroom, all the people in our newsrooms, do you have the numbers yet? We just want to know the numbers. And I think that, as a meteorologist and as meteorologists across the country, our simple messaging is that it only takes one. And I know you guys repeat that as much as we do, as local forecasters. So it truly does only takes one. I know a lot of work goes into these forecasts, but we always, kind of wrap up our episodes with no matter how many storms form, one is all it takes. Dr. Brennan, my question for you, we talked a little bit before the stream about what your role is, and you talked a little bit about looking forward and what you guys are, looking at changing with the National Hurricane Center and your messaging. Speaking of messaging, you guys do have a new experimental cone out this year in trying to change a little bit of that messaging and it's not just a coastal impact. Talk a little bit about the upgrades to the National Hurricane Center cone that you guys are putting out. This was just released a few weeks ago.
Yeah, so what you're looking at on the right side is an experimental version of the cone graphic. So the cone is the same in both graphics. It's just in the new version, it's all white. It doesn't have that sort of hatching area for day 3 to 5, which some social science and user interviews suggested might be somewhat confusing to people when they look at it. They think it might be a rainfall area or something else. But the big change in the version on the right is we're adding the depiction of tropical storm and hurricane watches and warnings over inland areas to the cone graphic. The legacy version, the current version that you see on the left, we only depicted those areas along the immediate coastline. And this is an example from Hurricane Ian a couple of years ago. And you can see that by looking on the right, you see that there's hurricane warnings in effect for, much of this central and west central portions of the Florida Peninsula, all the way through the Tampa Bay area into central Florida. And you see tropical storm warnings covering almost the entire peninsula and extending up inland into portions of Georgia and South Carolina. So this is a better depiction, or a more accurate depiction, of the wind hazard risk that's associated with the storm. And because we're choosing to highlight those wind watches and warnings, we're reminding people that those impacts often and almost always occur outside the cone itself within that watch warning timeframe. So it's part of a bigger focus on hazards. We're not just rolling out the new cone. We have a relatively new still watch and warning that we issue explicitly for storm surge, which is the deadliest hazard historically in tropical storms and hurricanes, and drives most of the evacuation decisions that are made in the United States. So we're able to highlight those areas that are explicitly at risk of that life-threatening inundation, putting more of a focus on inland flooding and the watches and warnings that go along with that hazard, because that's been the deadliest hazard in the United States over the last 10 or 11 years. So again, trying to shift people away from a focus on the track or the category or the exact intensity of the storm, and more onto those hazards, because the hazards are what kill people. And we have a lot of information we can provide about the risk associated with those various hazards. And this new cone is one way we're trying to move in that direction.
And just one more follow-up to that. Do you have anything, any new experimental products that you'll be debuting in the next couple of years that you're looking at? Or is it just going to be enhancing that messaging with the storm surge and the inland flooding threat?
Well, we'll see for the cone here. We'll see how this experimental period goes this year, and then we'll look at feedback and comments from users and see how it went. We may decide to keep it experimental next year. We may try to make it operational, make some additional changes based on that feedback. We're looking at potentially going out to day 7 with our track and intensity forecast at some point in the next few years. So likely to see some sort of experimental version of that. The graphical depiction of how you show a 7-day track forecast will be an interesting space to try to move into from a public messaging perspective, not just for us here at the Hurricane Center, but for you all in the broadcast media. How do you depict where a storm might be in 6 or 7 days, given the uncertainty of those time ranges? We're trying to push our storm surge information out farther into the future in real time. Originally, it was about 2 days out. Now we're almost up to 3 days. So we're trying to continue to move out in that direction as well.
I do love the storm surge model. I remember when it debuted and when they did that more detailed mapping around Florida. Could you envision something like that for inland flooding so that we could get a better visual picture of what inland flooding could look like?
Yeah, the National Weather Service is actually working on rolling out flood inundation mapping across the United States. It's coming out in sort of different pieces of the country. We're up to 10 to 30% this year, and then it's going to expand out to additional parts of the country in the next 2 or 3 years. And that will try to provide a geographic footprint of inundation from freshwater flooding across the country, to give people an idea of, hey, here's an area that might be underwater from flooding from a creek or river or stream. And that will, again, help people to visualize what the impacts of that flooding inundation might look like. So we're sort of building on the experience we've had with the storm surge modeling and the products we have there, and trying to push that into other hazards associated with water inundation.
Of course, live with Dr. Michael Brennan of the National Hurricane Center. As promised, we're now going to get to your live questions and comments. You know the system. For those of you who've been with us here on the program before, use a hashtag, ask a question. That's how simply it works. Mark Messenger on the WFLA Facebook page, hashtag Hey Amanda. When should we anticipate another storm to come through the Tampa, St. Pete area? I'm really glad that Mark brings up this question, because Dr. Brennan, we were really looking forward to asking you specifically about our area.
Yeah.
People are always asking, okay, is it going to hit the Panhandle, New Orleans, Texas Gulf Coast? We're hyper focused on Tampa Bay, and there's this general sense, and has been a general sense for years, that we have been in large part, protected or spared, if you will. What's your vantage point from the NHC's perspective on the Tampa Bay area and hurricanes and tropical storms?
Well, it's certainly a very vulnerable area. I mean, you've got Tampa Bay, you've got, Pinellas County, you have a lot of water that's surrounding very populated areas. You have a large number of people living in storm surge evacuation zones, and that is one of the most storm surge sensitive locations in the United States. So certainly there has been some pretty good luck for the Tampa Bay region over the last few years. As far as when we're going to know when a storm might threaten the region, it could happen in the next week. It could happen in the next month. It could happen multiple times before this hurricane season is over. If you look at our track forecast areas, they go up about 30 to 40 miles a day. And so, you're really only able to hone in on the area that's going to get the very, very worst conditions within maybe about a day of landfall. So people have to prepare over a larger area because of the uncertainty and because of the risk that hurricanes pose, especially along the Florida Gulf Coast, where the storm surge risk is very, very large, and where if you have a storm like Ian or like Idalia moving parallel to the coast, a shift in the track of only 20 or 30 miles from east to west may make a difference in 100 or 150 miles along the actual coastline as to where the center crosses the coast. So we have to account for that risk when we issue those watches and warnings and when evacuation decisions are made by local officials. So just because a storm didn't hit you and you didn't get those worst conditions doesn't mean that the risk wasn't there and that you more than likely took the right steps and the right precautions by preparing, by following those evacuation orders, because the risk is so high, especially in the Tampa Bay region.
So you used the word luck. I heard. So are we lucky, or have we been lucky the last few years? Is that how you would sum it up?
Well, yeah, I mean, some of it just comes down to, a little shift or a little wiggle or wobble in the track makes a huge difference in where a storm can move. I mean, you could say the same thing about here in Southeast Florida. We haven't had a major hurricane landfall on the southeast coast of Florida in more than 30 years, since Andrew in 1992. So, it's not unusual for, again, hurricane core of a major hurricane is pretty small. For the odds of it hitting one particular area, in a given year are relatively low, but that risk is always there. So it's not, you can go many, many years without a direct landfall or direct worst impacts in your area, but that doesn't mean you have to be prepared because that risk is there every season.
Dr. Brennan, we have, we actually have two more questions in the queue, but we're going to save the third one for the very, very tail end of the show. Like, we'll end on it. The second one, let me tell you something. People love Sahara Dust, and I'm curious if people at the NHC, if you and your team are aware of how popular Sahara Dust is because of, obviously, the protective qualities of Saharan dust. What do you have to say?
Well, it's definitely gotten a lot more notoriety. I mean, it's something folks forecasting hurricanes have known about for many, many years. It's something we can see in satellite imagery. We obviously have a better understanding of the dynamics of it now, and we know that it tends to be most prevalent and widespread across the deep tropical Atlantic. It tends to be in that sort of July, August timeframe, but it's mostly dust that comes off of the Saharan desert, carried westward by the strong African easterly jet up in the mid-levels of the atmosphere. And it's not so much the dust itself, although it does have some properties that tend to reflect sunlight and may lead to ocean cooling, but it's more that the dust is sort of indicative of dry, stable air that's in place, and that tends to suppress shower and thunderstorm development, which is critical to getting tropical depressions and tropical storms to form. So when you have that sort of dry, dusty air mass in place, it does tend to tamp down hurricane activity across that deep tropical Atlantic. But as you notice, you're talking about dust thinning out. It's episodic. It's not always the same, and it does tend to wane as we get towards the peak of the season. And that moisture and that there's more favorable conditions tend to return. But yeah, it's gotten a lot more attention in the last few years. But it does have a role and an impact on how the season plays out.
I'd like to shout out Joseph Still with the Saharan dust question, but a lot of other questions in our comment section, man, about Saharan dust, as always.
We always get them, Dr. Brennan. We love to see it as meteorologists. I'm sure you guys love to see it at the National Hurricane Center to kind of hang out and limit some of that tropical activity. But as we know, and as you just said, it does tend to kind of thin out as we go through the rest of the season. So speaking of the rest of the season, looking ahead to the next few weeks, do you anticipate, from the National Hurricane Center's forecasting standpoint, do you anticipate us seeing this uptick in activity, these tropical waves moving into more of a favorable environment for us to see actual tropical systems forming as we head into peak season?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the expectation, is we're going to see an uptick in activity. We see an uptick in activity in September almost every hurricane season, regardless of what any seasonal forecast says. The next 2 or 3 weeks tend to be the most active weeks of the season. And again, you can see activity and storms forming all the way from just off the west coast of Africa, all the way across the tropical Atlantic, the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, up into the mid-latitudes even. So, and that, again, that risk, especially in busy years, and especially with the expectation that La Nina is going to develop and strengthen as we get later into the hurricane season, can tend to result in more favorable conditions, especially over the western part of the basin, which is pretty concerning for interest in Florida, in the United States, the Gulf, the Caribbean, because that can result in those systems that tend to form and then rapidly strengthen and make landfall within just a few days. So we're not always going to have a week or more to watch a system like Beryl come all the way across the Atlantic. We might have a Michael or an Ian or something that develops and then rapidly strengthens and makes landfall within just a few days. So it's a good reminder that as we are, basically in the peak of hurricane season now, that's why it's so important for everybody to have that hurricane plan in place, have their emergency supplies ready, because you might only have a few days to put your plan into action and get ready for an approaching storm.
Dr. Brennan, we were talking about, I swear this was not a pre-coordinated question that came in the chat on social media. We have our Tracking the Tropics super fans out there. Steve Simon on Facebook says, #Hey Michael, can I visit the NHC? There are a lot of people that are fascinated by weather and by the NHC specifically that would love to see what you guys do.
Yeah, in the past, we've had public tours largely in the off season. You can go to hurricanes.gov and find information about that there. We obviously didn't have them during COVID, and we had some building work going on last season where we weren't able to host them, but we may be able to have some of those. They tend to happen in the sort of January, February, March timeframe. So again, go to hurricanes.gov. You can look and try to find some information there as we get into the upcoming off season. But yeah, certainly know lots of people are interested, but on our website, you can get a virtual tour. You can see pictures of the forecasters. You can see pictures of the operations area, get a sense for how we operate and what we do here.
Well, yeah, the three weather nerds around your screen, us, we would love to come see it someday. Let's just end this by saying we appreciate the National Hurricane Center, and please share that with your entire team. The work you do is absolutely extraordinary. It goes unnoticed by so many people out there, but to us in the weather community, we are so extremely appreciative, and thank you for your time today.
Great to be with you all. Appreciate the partnership.
Again, Dr. Michael Brennan, the director of the National Hurricane Center here on Tracking the Tropics. That's going to do it for this week's episode, of course, of Tracking the Tropics. We are live on whatever website, app, or social media platform that you're on right now on Tuesdays at 12:30 Eastern, 11:30 Central, or when storms form. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time here from the Stream Center in Tampa, Florida. Bye-bye, folks.
Find Tracking the Tropics on these platforms. And for storm updates, the latest models, and helpful resources, visit trackingthetropics.tv.